she laid out a really, really good foundation from day one, which meant that even if you didn't understand something, you had the tools to tell her that you didn't understand something, and she could stop the class and explain everything. So that was something that I was mind blown, because I was like, wow, this is what a good teacher is.
Hello, welcome back to Ready to Redo, where each week we're mixing mediocre humour with the juicy topic of redoing education. Today we're joined by the lovely Moeko Reilly from Brisbane. Moeko's had an extensive experience with languages, from growing up speaking Japanese and English, to studying Korean and Spanish in uni, and then working as a teaching assistant for 3 years in Spain. We discuss misconceptions with learning, the importance of work experience, and also fangirl about why languages are brilliant and why other subjects desperately need to follow this immersive way of learning. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, then please email. The email is also in the podcast description. Okay, enough of me blabbing. Let's jump straight into it.
In my second year, I decided that it would probably be smart to take up languages as an elective. And I wanted to take a language, but I also didn't want to challenge myself too much, which sounds really bad, actually. Coming out of high school, I felt like I was really bad at learning. I felt like until there were certain peaks in my learning, but when I hit grade 12, I thought, wow, I'm like a really bad student. It's kind of like a miracle that I'm even going to university. There's no value in me learning. It's kind of a waste of time. So I hit a bit of a low point in learning.
How did you come to that conclusion?
I think my confidence was really knocked about because there was a lot of pressure to take certain classes if you wanted to do certain subjects in university, which I'm sure is the same everywhere.
Yeah.
But I originally wanted to further my studies in science or something science related, because it was something that I was relatively good at in grade 10. But I got to grade 11 and I started failing chemistry. I didn't get along with my teacher. My maths wasn't very good either. So suddenly I was like, oh, I'm not a science student. I have to change to humanities.
Yeah, a lot of students have those misconceptions. And yeah, I've ranted so much about this, which is students only get one perspective of how they learn. So your experience with your teacher caused the experience with your subject, as well as how it was taught and everything. But if you change just one thing, if you changed who your teacher was, or if you changed the pace at which the class was taught, you could have a completely different idea of who you are as a science student. Definitely. Or a math student.
It was a really frustrating point because in grade 10 I did work experience at the university as a molecular biologist.
Oh.
So I was gearing up to become some kind of scientist. But in grade 11 I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so bad at science. Who am I kidding? I'm not going to be able to sustain this for 2 years and then do a degree and become a professional.
Right. How was the difference between work experience and then the learning of the content? Were you expected to demonstrate a lot of knowledge in that placement?
I actually thought it was a really good placement because they place us in different labs every day. So you get exposure to different kinds of, parts of molecular biology. And a lot of the times they did ask a lot of us that were really practical kind of science things, okay, go and make a buffer and go and check out this bacteria and, kind of analyze it and see what you can find from it. As opposed to what we did in school, which is just learning how to do equations and, just passive learning, I suppose. It was a lot more hands-on, and it was a moment where I was like, oh, everything I learned in grade 10 science up until that point was then applicable to what I was doing in the lab. So that made so much sense to me.
And you can actually see what the point of you having studied from like year 7 to 10 was for, because you're like, what do I do with this information otherwise?
I decided to take Korean, and I found I really enjoyed it. And I had a lot of moments where I was like, oh my God, I understand. Like, this completely makes sense. And it kind of reaffirmed that maybe I'm not a shitty learner.
Yeah.
And that was really good. That was really, really helpful, I thought.
That's why I love languages, because I feel like languages are one of the subjects where you can explicitly see the outcome of your hard work. As soon as you understand a sentence, you're like, oh, I couldn't understand that before, but now I can directly see how I've grown as a student because you've experienced it in such a practical way. As opposed to a lot of other subjects, you can't exactly see how much you've really developed yourself, because there are, I would say, rarely times that you can in your daily life apply your learning, apply the theory to your life. So yeah, especially with languages, I totally agree. Like, as soon as you understand a sentence from a show, or you can read like a sign or a menu, like you can read a menu, you're like, I made it.
That's why it's such a rewarding kind of field to go into as well, because you can see your results. And I know a lot of people talk about like the language plateau, where you learn a language and in the beginning you're like learning so much and then you plateau. But realistically, there are still going to be points in your language learning where you see, like, you read a menu or you hear something, or, you know, things where you're like, oh wow, I am improving. And for somebody whose confidence was so like battered down through my science experience, I thought that was really, really nice in supporting me and being like, hey, you can learn as well. Look, you're making progress in these things.
Okay, so then you learn Korean, but then you also learn Spanish. Let's go into Spanish as well. What happened there?
I had an extra elective left that I needed to take. And I thought it was kind of a waste to go back to learning Korean when I wasn't pursuing a degree in Korean. And it was only one semester, so I thought, okay, I'm going to learn like a new language. It's interesting because, like Korean, one of my really good friends from high school, she is Colombian, and she used to kind of teach me a little bit of Spanish and Colombian culture. So I was like, great, I'm going to do a semester of Spanish. And it wasn't something that I thought too deeply about. But yeah, I did that and graduated and completely forgot all my Spanish.
Yeah, and I find that so fascinating, because you spend like a whole semester learning something. For some like some people, the whole high school experience they spend learning a language. And as soon as they leave, they're like, I can't even have a conversation with someone in that language. You've spent 6 years, something crazy like that. You spent 6 years learning a subject, but you can't actually apply it. There is an issue there, not just with languages, with anything, but languages make it more explicit. We can see, like, can you apply your knowledge here? So I guess you forgot that semester's worth of stuff. And like, how did they even teach you? How did they teach Spanish at uni?
It's really interesting because my teacher was actually amazing. She was brilliant. It's in that situation, unlike in high school, it was 150% my own fault that I forgot everything, because, you know, they say language is a muscle. If you don't keep using it, it's just going to wither away. And that was definitely it. My teacher my professor, I should say, was this amazing educator who from day one was like, I'm only speaking to you in Spanish because this is Spanish, but I'm going to teach you how to ask the important questions, like, how do you say this in English? Or what does this mean in Spanish? Or, you know, she laid out a really, really good foundation from day one, which meant that even if you didn't understand something, you had the tools to tell her that you didn't understand something, and she could stop the class and everything. So that was something that I was mind blown, because I was like, wow, this is what a good teacher is. After I had such a positive experience with this teacher, I graduated university and I had the feeling that a lot of students have where I thought, I've graduated, what am I going to do now? My degree is useless, which isn't the case, but you know, you enter that mindset. So I decided, okay, we're going to go back to what I was so opposed to and like become a teacher. I'm going to do a diploma in teaching English. So, in the process of becoming a teacher and learning how I am as a learner to kind of link up with how I could be as an educator, that really changed my perspective on what I had thought a teacher was. You know, when I first entered university and I was like, I don't want to be a teacher, I hated my chemistry teacher or my math teacher, or whatever, I really changed the way I thought. And I felt like, wow, I want to be able to become a teacher that, okay, maybe the student doesn't like me, but I want the student to come out of it and be like, I learned something, you know, even if they don't retain all the information, like with my Spanish class, for them to turn around and be like, wow, the way that that teacher kind of taught me was useful to me in some way or form. Mm-hmm. So that really changed the way I thought. And I started working as an English teacher in Brisbane. And during that time, my Spanish professor sent me an email and was like, hey, I remember you took Spanish in my class, and I thought maybe this is a program that you'd be interested in. You can go to Spain and be a teaching assistant in a high school or a primary school. So you can apply for it if it's something that you're interested in. I just thought, you know, I thought of you. So that was really, really nice of her, because I was so shocked. I took one semester, you know, with her, and she remembered who I was, and that made me think, okay, maybe there is like a reason for this opportunity coming my way. So I applied for it and kind of forgot about it, and they were like, oh, you're going to Spain, and I got approved, and I ended up going for 3 years. I decided to put myself in a homestay when I first arrived because I was working in a town in the middle of nowhere. So I stayed with a family who are now, they're like my Spanish family. They're the kindest souls ever. But the mum and the daughter speak English as well, but the father didn't speak any English. So he was kind of like my testing period of learning just how bad my Spanish was. And I was like, wow, it goes to show a semester of Spanish in university doesn't get you far if you don't keep, you know, working at that skill.
I find that, so this is basically immersion, like immersing yourself and forcing yourself to be bloody uncomfortable. Like I'm also learning Spanish, but I applied it to just conversation classes in Melbourne. And just going into one session, I felt so uncomfortable. Everyone around me is speaking another language fluently. And I'm here like, hola. And it is so hard because what you've learned from a book is so different because, first of all, people speak colloquially. They don't teach you how to speak colloquially in a textbook. And suddenly they're throwing slang over here, and you can say grammar perfectly, but that sounds weird to them. And you're like, but I'm abiding by the textbook. And they're like, don't do that. How strange is that? Because suddenly what is technically correct is not applicable in real life context. There is such a discrepancy between what is taught and what is actually expected, not just for languages, for everything. We can learn a shit ton of theory, but applying that to real life, you have to factor in who are these people, first of all. Like, everyone's different. How do you communicate what you've learned to this specific context?
Spanish was a completely different culture that I was not used to. Already with that, I was so out of my comfort zone. People started to call me, they used to call me like the quiet Japanese girl because I couldn't speak. I had nothing to say. You know, you have those moments where you're in a group situation. Oh, I hated group shit situations so much because I was like, I'm not going to say a thing. I'm not going to be able to keep up. People are talking and you finally understand a sentence that was spoken like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And, I was just like, oh my God, I'm never gonna be able to contribute anything. And it was so daunting. But because I lived in this town in the countryside, I had no choice but to speak Spanish.
It's so hard when you immerse yourself because you are forced, absolutely forced, to just
Yeah.
cop it and make mistakes. But you improve like one semester versus 3 days in another country immersed in it. The amount of improvement you make in 3 days is crazy. And that just makes me think like, okay, so we're in uni, we're spending a semester on this stuff. It's not a matter of we can only learn at one semester's pace. Like we can learn this content in 10 days, what we learn in a semester. How can we make the course more applicable to life and make us learn in a way that's more immersive and applicable? And I've started to think about that with every subject. Like, how can we transfer what we do with languages, where it's quite common to go to exchange or to live in another country, but often other subjects you don't have an exchange. Like there is no equivalent. You're just expected to do what you do with languages, learn the theory, and then never apply it, or at least never apply it until you have a job. If we were able to do more internships, or if we were able to do more practicals in school and in uni, the amount of progress you can make in like a week if you're expected to work in a lab and directly apply your knowledge full time, the improvements that you would make, not only with your theory, but how you communicate with others, how you can collaborate your ideas and sort of see, okay, what I know is not entirely what's right for this situation. How can I learn from that? And that, I think, is a very necessary improvement on like the education system, is to make it more practical. Like put us into these really uncomfortable situations, because if we're uncomfortable, we're going to learn a lot quicker.
And I think like one thing I always think is a little disappointing. I don't know if it's changed now, but definitely when I was in high school, work experience wasn't something that everyone did. The reason why I did it was because I thought, oh, something like working in a lab is very specific. If I don't get the experience when I'm younger, I won't understand what that environment is like. It was to the extent where I think only like 5 students from my grade did work experience. Maybe there was slightly more. It definitely was not the majority of the cohort that did it, because they don't really sell it for you very well, and you have to give up your September holidays to do it, and things like that. So because of that, a lot of people just didn't do it. They thought, I don't want to waste my time working and not getting paid for something, when the school really should have been like, okay, you're not getting paid, but this is going to lead to you being able to kind of solidify, okay, this is what I want to do in the future, or maybe it's something that you don't want to do.
Yeah, for sure. I think, the process of elimination, super important. I feel like it's more practical because there are so many things out there. At least you can eliminate what you, if you're just in that situation, you can definitely say that's not for me. Because work experience in my school was like, it was compulsory. You actually, it was 1 week in year 10. And the school actually blocked off a week during the term for you to go and do placement. And this was anywhere you wanted. I ended up doing it at a lab and seeing like a real life foot. Like the guy just, I should give more context. So I worked in pathology, and he, cancer research and all of this stuff. And our supervisor basically said, I have a foot in this box. Basically, I have a foot in this box. It's been severed. The person has died. In more medical terms than that, but he was like, I want to see. And I'm like, yes, show us. And so he showed it to us. I'm in awe. My friend is in awe. We're like, this is so, so cool. Why don't we get that in normal class? Please explain. And that just made it so much more fascinating. And I just think like work experience in year 10, a compulsory work experience was so important. But what if we did that? What if we did work experience in year 7? You go straight into year 7, you learn your maths. Okay, cool. But how can I apply the maths I just learned to life? Because that way we're actually engaging students with what's the point of me learning this? To, okay, we'll bring you into this 3 days into this place where you're expected to know this knowledge upon other things. Now you can see sort of what the goal is, like why you need to know this information. Because with languages, I love it because, okay, so say if you don't know theory behind how to ask for something, you go to the supermarket and you realize, shit, I can't ask for this. So you now have a goal to work for. Like, I need to know this because I can see a direct relevance to why and when I need to use it.
100%.
Yeah, and so if students have that opportunity, even in primary school, oh my God, how amazing. Like in primary school as well, you have that work experience, how much you're able to get uncomfortable and learn and see the point in what you learn.
I think it also then does a really good job of teaching young learners about like responsibility in terms of being able to be responsible for your own learning. Not to say that if any mistakes happen or if you're unable to learn something originally, it's not 100% your fault. Obviously, as a learner, there are whole other factors as well. But to be able to take charge of your learning, maybe that's a better way of saying it, and be like, okay, well, these are the things that I'm learning. What can I do to change this? You know, I think it's important to have those ideas running through our minds at an earlier age rather than only having that realization when you're in university. You know, then you've almost wasted 12 or so years of your education being like, oh, I was just like led to learn these things rather than me being the one learning this information. And I think then that will change also how much information we retain as learners if we start to be able to think, oh, this is important information that I want to keep.
Yeah, because it could be incredibly important information. But if we're not even able to see how can I apply this knowledge, like, is it really important to me? We're never going to actually retain it to the point where it's in our long-term memory. Sure, we might remember it for that week, but if we can't see how it's relevant to us, like what can we do with this information? It's not important until we go into the real world and do a placement or something. Yeah. Oh, like ranting is good.
Thanks for sticking around this far. Hope you're enjoying this Ready to Redo episode. Now on to the last part.
Some people call it like experimental learning instead of kind of going with the aim, shoot, fire. It's sort of like fire, shoot, aim sort of situation in that you, instead of kind of laying out a process, you just jump into situations. And I definitely think you end up picking up interesting kind of knowledge in that way. For example, like when I first got to Spain, I couldn't even order orange juice properly, but I had a conversation with my Spanish father, my host father, I should say, about like flooding in a certain area in the south. And for some reason, that conversation went really well, even though I still couldn't order orange juice. It was just because of the way, I suppose, that he was able to explain words and use like visual references to help kind of bridge those gaps in my knowledge, that suddenly I couldn't do everyday things, but I could have a conversation about flooding in certain areas in rural Spain, you know? So I think from having those experimental moments, not to say that you should learn a whole language based on that, but I think to use it as a tool is really smart. You get to kind of jump into a new situation and test the waters with something and think, okay, well, actually, I have a lot of knowledge in this field that I didn't realize I had a lot of knowledge, yet maybe there are these aspects that I still need to work on.
Yeah, I find that, yeah, why don't we even sort of get you into the deep end, like have a placement or whatever it is with like barely any knowledge so that you can see what you need to improve on. Is it the grammar that you're having trouble with? Is it the vocab? Where really are you struggling? Instead of like accumulating this knowledge and not just learning everything blindly and yeah, doing that like disjointed learning thing where you can see the point in why you're studying it and you can see exactly what you need to improve on.
Definitely. I think that, I mean, it's understandable that that scares a lot of people. A lot of people like structure in their learning, and they want to start at a point and learn how to say their name and do these things. But perhaps with other languages, I have better personal experience with, like, I went to France last summer at the end of the summer, and I visited Lyon. And I don't speak French. I wouldn't classify myself as a French speaker. I personally don't think that I could hold a conversation in French. Yet I booked a driver to kind of take me to the airport. And he told me, I don't speak any English. I don't speak any Spanish. I only speak French and like Tunisian Arabic. So I was like, oh, great. Okay, well, this is like a 30-minute drive that I can't just stay silent. So we had a conversation in French, in this language that I supposedly couldn't speak. And it went really well. We talked about meaningful things. He taught me about the language in Tunisia and how it's like a combination of different things. I told him about my language background, which is all kind of, I guess, medium to high level conversation, you know, but with very basic language on my part. Yeah. And I think that's like a very good example of when you're put in a situation where you're like, okay, this isn't even a language I've learned, but you can draw from your experiences and be able to put things together. And that in turn makes you think, oh, this is actually something that I am capable of doing. And if you aren't, then you'll think, oh, okay, this is something that maybe was too high of a hurdle this time, but it's something that I could aim for next time. I think those are really important to keep in mind.
And you know what? The environment, the learning environment that you're in is super important, because what I can see in like those situations is because it's an act of necessity, like you literally need it to communicate, the other opposing person is not judging you because it's just an explicit like exchange of knowledge. Like there is no other way. And so when that barrier of judgment has just been wiped out, the amount of stuff you can now say, do, whatever, show your knowledge, it just becomes so much easier because, again, like they don't expect much of you. And so when that's happening, you actually are able to show more of your knowledge than, say, if the person is expecting you to say something really well, because then you'll start to freeze and start to sort of censor yourself and second guess yourself as well. So
definitely,
I think like learning environments where people are not judging others, where you make it explicit that failure is important, that making mistakes is important, that there is necessity. If the whole class, you could only speak in Spanish, like your teacher was specifically only speaking Spanish to you guys, but what if the classmates even had to speak Spanish with each other? Like how would that change everything?
Like you said, in my situation with speaking in French, I remember telling him in French in the very beginning, like, oh, I don't speak French. And he was like, oh, that's okay. I don't speak any other languages though. So this is the only way we're going to be able to communicate. And then you think, okay, well, they know that I don't speak French, but I still want to be able to communicate things. And they are so much then more open to trying to piece together what you're trying to say. And I think we often forget that a lot of times the people we're communicating with don't really care if your language is perfect. Like if somebody is speaking to you in English and their English isn't 100%, you're not going to completely shut out what they're saying just because you can't, just because they don't sound like a fluent native speaker. You know, you're still going to be able to try and understand. And if you don't understand, you can kind of ask them. And if that doesn't work, you just kind of take a new rude, you know. So I think that's something, if you put yourself in the opposite situation, you wouldn't be judging a person, but we tend to forget that when we feel vulnerable in that situation.
For sure. Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you, Moeko. Great conversation. Great ranting. I love it. Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed this Ready to Redo episode. Special thanks to Moeko for joining us. And if you want to check out more of her work, then search up starting_conversations on Instagram. Awesome. See you next week.